Our vision is of a network of networks which will enable the researcher through the window of their workstation to access all the computing, communications, data, software resources that they need to do their work. Did we envisage it would become, at that time, 1985, 1986, the global communications infrastructure? No, we did not.
The main problem of EARN, of course, was that because of the European monopolies, only the incumbents, the PTTs in the countries, on legally supposed to provide traffic and exchange of data between countries. And they came to EARN and said, what you're doing is illegal. And then eventually we convinced them that it was just a community of people communicating to each other, although they were in different countries. They were also insisting that we migrate this traffic to a different protocol, because all this network was based on an open protocol developed by IBM. But still, for the Commission, this was not a good thing, and they wanted to use an European protocol.
We knew that there was some coordination needed between all this, at least coordinated IPv4 addresses at the time. Because, for instance, CERN, in their wisdom, when they set up their IP network, they used the number 1 network. And of course, that didn't work because somebody in the US already had that. When these networks interconnected, and interconnecting them was also easy because it didn't need any special permission. We had to have coordinated address space and operational things. And we said, okay, let's start this coordination activity. Let's do this informally because we just want to do pragmatic stuff. And that's how RIPE came about.
Hi, I'm Anastasia Pak, and this is the RIPE Labs podcast. The voices you've just heard are those of 3 internet pioneers, all of whom were at the forefront of networking and the early evolution of the internet in the US and Europe. The first, Dennis Jennings, was the first president of the European Academic and Research Network, EARN, and the first program director of the National Science Foundation Network, NSFNET. The second, Daniele Bovio, was the technical manager of EARN and also a member of the EBONE action team, the group which designed the first pan-European internet backbone. And the third is Daniel Karrenberg, one of the founders of RIPE and the RIPE NCC. EARN, one of the key organizations that connects my 3 guests, was active long before the internet was widely available, as the first multi-vendor computer communications network in Europe. This year, the organization celebrated its 40th anniversary, and following that event, I spoke to each of my guests about how the internet grew out of those early days, when its purpose and much of the excitement around its development lay in the promise of connecting researchers from around the world with one another. To start us off, here is Daniel Karrenberg, who kindly joined me in the special episode to share his reflections on this exciting time in the internet's early history. Here's Daniel on his work at EUnet, the early years of RIPE, and the first aha moment he experienced when he saw for himself how the internet was going to let researchers from all over the world work together.
When Dennis and Daniele were busy with EARN, I was busy with something called EUnet. And that was, EARN was a network of IBM mainframe computer centers. EUnet was a network of Unix computers, and those were much smaller computers than the IBM mainframes. They were called mini computers at the time, and they were running the Unix operating system. And Unix was actually before Linux. It was the first operating system that could be ported between different sorts of computers. Before that, operating systems were delivered by the computer manufacturer. So if you bought a computer, you got the operating system with it. That was a bundle. And Unix was developed at Bell Labs, actually one of the telephone companies, ironically enough. And it was written in a high-level language. It was not written in the machine language. And I actually came into contact with networking through this Unix operating system, because in 1982, I had a summer job for a German company who had built a new computer, and they wanted Unix at the operating system. And believe it or not, Microsoft was then selling a Unix system. They called it Xenix, with an X, Xenix. And they were offering services that you could actually bring your computer to Redmond in the US, and they would give you an environment where you could cross-compile your operating system on one of their digital equipment machines, and then download it to your machine. So the hardware guy of that company, they were called Basis Mini Computer, and we flew to Redmond. We got an office there, and we set up our computer, and we started porting the operating system. He was making additional components for me, so that this computer could run Unix, and I was sort of busy porting Unix. And at one point, I didn't understand some of the code in the Unix operating system. And I went to the guy there who was the kernel guru, the person who was really knowledgeable. And I said, hey, I don't understand this. And we both couldn't understand it. And I asked the guy what to do. And he said, oh, well, we have this network called EUnet. And I said, oh, what's that? And he said, well, we can send electronic mail to other computers, but even more, we have news groups. I'd never heard about news groups. And news groups were like interest groups where you could just post messages. The closest what we have today is Google Groups. There was a news group called comp.os operating system.unix. And he said, why don't you post, your question to that group? Maybe there's someone who knows that. And I said, I'm German, my English isn't so good. Well, he said, well, you draft a message and I'll give you the right netiquette kind of thing. So I drafted the message, and he said, okay, you put it like this, and we sent it out. And this was still in the same kind of networking that EARN had, store and forward. One machine sends to the next, to the next, to the next. And the Microsoft machine only sent and received news groups in the evenings, because telephone calls were cheaper in the evenings, even in the US, although they were very cheap. They were even cheaper at night. I forgot about that, did some other work. And sometime in the afternoon the next day, this guy comes into my office and says, hey, Daniel, we have an answer. And I looked, and indeed, there was an answer. And it was even from Dennis Ritchie, one of my heroes. He is actually one of the inventors of the Unix operating system, together with Brian Kernighan and Ken Thompson. So the guy who actually sort of was the expert had answered me and said, Daniel, don't worry. This depends on a side effect in the hardware that is not documented. And then we both laughed, understood it, and I could continue my work. And that was an aha moment for me. Absolutely, it's like the possibility to ask a question to a knowledgeable group that was geographically dispersed. Dennis was on the U.S. East Coast and in Murray Hill, New Jersey. And I was in Redmond, Washington. So across the continent, and actually this guy bothered to answer my lowly question. And when I returned to Germany, to university, I said, I want this too. I had sort of informed myself, are people in Europe doing this? And yes, there were people in Europe doing this. And I found out that in my university, there were actually two guys who were also trying to connect to EUnet, one by the name of Horst Kästner. And I said, hey, Horst, I experienced this in the US, I want it here, can I help? And the rest is history. I got sucked into computer networking.
As we are recreating the memories of how the internet started, I want to give a bit of a longer introduction to our guests. Dennis Jennings was the first program director for networking to lead the establishment of the US National Science Foundation network, NSFNET, that eventually became a major part of the internet backbone. Dennis had a vision of an open network of networks, an internet designed to serve all of the US research and higher education, and was also behind the critical decision to use the TCP/IP protocol across NSFNet, which was a key contribution to the current internet architecture. Daniele Bovio was the technical manager of the Computer Center at the Italian National Research Council and played an important role in establishing the first Italian research backbone. At EARN, he was helping navigate complex routing issues while the network was expanding as more universities and research institutions got connected. He later joined America Online to, among other things, launch their European networks, contract and provision one of the first transatlantic submarine cables. Dennis and Daniele share how they got involved in networking to help the research community and what were the main challenges there in the early stages of the internet. Here's Dennis Jennings.
I first met networking in 1977 when I went to a colloquium, a conference in Trinity College, Dublin, on networking. And I was absolutely fascinated. There were all these people from America, from France, from the United Kingdom, from Germany, all the experts at the time. And I don't remember who was there. Louis Pouzin, I remember from France. Probably because Louis is a small man and I'm not a small man. But there was a German there who was a very large man, tall man. And I think Vint Cerf was there, but I'm not sure. Anyway, it was a colloquium. They were discussing networking, and they talked about connectionless and connection and packet switching and datagrams, and it was very much the state of the art there. And I was absolutely fascinated. And that year I became the director of the computing services in University College Dublin. So I ran the IT infrastructure then for 22 years. And I had lots of things to do to build that up. But in the early 80s, 1980s, I went back to networking because I thought that computer networking, or rather delivering services to researchers so that they could use email, access remotely computers, send files to one another, was really the sort of the next step in developing services for the academic community. So I got very interested in that, and in my travels I had met a man called Ira Fuchs, who was the computer czar, the head of computing in City University of New York and later in Princeton. And he told me, I'd met BITNET, I'd talked about BITNET, I knew people who were on BITNET in the US, and Ira informed me that IBM was going to sponsor the connection of BITNET to Europe and to create something that was tentatively called the European Academic Research Network, EARN.
That's how EARN was born then.
And in 1983, I telephoned Ira, and among many things we discussed, I said, well, what's happened to this European network that you told me about? And he said, oh, well, the first meeting is being organized by a man called Herb Budd from IBM. IBM are sponsoring it. They're going to pay for the international lines. The big 6 countries in Europe, France, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, I think, going to talk about setting up this network.
And it was still people from the academic.
People from the academia. Oh yes, this was
so only
only academics, or rather only the people who provided networking services on IBM computers around Europe. So we had a meeting in 1983. The 6 guys, maybe more, from the big countries, and Dennis from Ireland.
Yeah.
And they elected me as the first president, which only meant chairman, but the first president of the EARN network. Now that was before EARN was formalized into an association. So many people only count presidents from the formal days.
Okay.
In which case I was the second president. So if you look at the web, you'll see pictures of me as the second president, but actually I was the first
so the
president.
President Zero.
President Zero, exactly right. And IBM were enormously generous. They funded leased line links between universities across Europe, which were very, very expensive. And they did that because they wanted to support the research community, and they wanted to introduce networking to the academic community. And it was based on an internal IBM network called VNet, which used the same technology for electronic mail and file transfer between researchers and administrators within IBM globally. Very quickly, IBM funded the lines were installed, and then we hit a problem. The PTTs, the telephone companies, which at that stage in Europe were all national monopolies, and PTT stood for posts, telegraphs, and telecommunications. And they had a complete monopoly on all electronic communication between people. So you had an IBM machine, you had the software, and the software was pretty crude. In simple terms, it sent messages from one computer to another computer, pretending the other computer was a printer. So it says, okay, I've got this file, print it over there.
Right.
And the remote computer would receive the file and acknowledge it, and then look at the details and say, oh, it's for someone in Italy or another country or another computer, and it would pretend that computer is another printer and send the file there. So conceptually, it was very simple, and it worked absolutely brilliantly. It allowed electronic mail, file transfer, and some instant messaging, a bit like social messaging we have now.
And now Daniele Bovio.
I'm an astrophysicist, but I also had a parallel curriculum on computer science. And I got my first job at the National Research Council in Italy. There was one man managing the entire data center. There were three of us getting a new position there, and he told us, I need you to support me on the data center. And I cut the tasks that you have to perform in 6 slices. Each of you will choose one slice, and I assigned the second slice myself. And that was 1985, was the beginning of the personal computers. And so one of the slides was personal computer, and I said I choose personal computers because I thought they would have bright future, right? And he told me immediately, okay, then the second slice I give you is networks. To which point I told him, look, I have studied network at the university, but I have no practical experience whatsoever. To which he replied, no problem, come with me. He brought me to the computer room, and under it there was the cold air that was flowing to refresh the various cabinets where the equipment was. So he brought me in front of a nice shelf that was full of little boxes with showing a lot of little bright lights, green light, red, yellow, all blinking, looks like almost as beautiful as a Christmas tree. Took the tool to lift the tile, brought one tile up, and it was like a huge mess and combination of cables of all sorts and sizes and colors. And he told me, that is the network. The cabinet where you find the tools is at the bottom of the computer room. Good luck.
Go figure it out.
Good luck. Go figure it out. I got also assigned 2 accounts on the computer. At the time, there was an IBM computer with a virtual machine operating system. And I noticed that on this machine, I was receiving on a monthly basis a fairly large file. So I went to him and I said, what is this about? To which he said, oh, I forgot to tell you. Our computer is connected to an international network, European, called EARN. And this network is connected to an American counterpart called BITNET. And these files that you're receiving are the routing tables. So you're supposed to install them on a monthly basis on this machine, so when the users try to send a file or a mail to somebody or communicate with somebody, this machine will know where to send the mail or which is going to be the next step to be sent. It was a store and forward network, so every node will have to receive the file, check what the next direction to go. And when I discovered that, and I realized that I could talk to people in America, in Canada, in the rest of Europe, just typing something on my computer from my office, that was the click for me. That said, wow, network is really cool, You can do things that unimaginable back then. Back then, there was no mobile phones. We're talking 1984, 1985. So
it was not only in Europe. So already the America
the Americans started first, and then the Canadian connected also to this network, and then thanks to a sponsorship from IBM that was trying to push the mainframe computers in the university market. I think at the largest point, the network reached almost 4,000 universities and research centers worldwide. Japan also, toward the end, got connected. But this mainframe computer had hundreds of users behind it. So one node was not just a small office with 3 people. One node was a university or a research center that had several dozens of terminals where people, or then eventually personal computers where people could use as a terminal. And so the traffic was increasing. The main problem of EARN, of course, was that at first, because of the European monopolies, only the incumbents, the PTTs in the countries on legally supposed to provide traffic and exchange of data between countries. And they came to EARN and they said, what you're doing is illegal. And then eventually we convinced them that it was just a community of people communicating to each other, although they were in different countries. And that was allowed, was not selling services to other people. We're just one community of people communicating with each other. Basically, the problem was that they were also insisting that we migrate this traffic to a different protocol, because all this network was based on an open protocol, but not a free open protocol. It was based on a protocol developed by IBM. It was public domain. People could see what it was, generate all sorts of emulating programs for other operating systems. So by large, there were way more non-IBM computers connected to these networks than IBM computers. But still, for the Commission, this was not a good thing, because back then there was an American protocol and they wanted to use an European protocol. What happened is that other people in Europe were also exploring the possibility to use a different protocol, which was not IBM, and was the TCP/IP protocol used by the first internet, ARPANET and DARPA in the United States. And that's what, by the way, that's where RIPE was born, right? RIPE stands for Réseau IP Européen, which is, the IP European. And somebody, in particular, was the SURFNet, the academic network in the Netherlands, had the idea to propose an alternative to the various European academic networks, and said, let's put the funds together and create an experimental multi-protocol IP-X25 backbone. If we merge all the money together, we are able to do it. So we test both X25 and native IP, and then we'll see what happens. And that happened toward the end of 1991. Of course, this was very interesting because EARN was saturated and we didn't have money to buy extra circuits, but we saw that cooperating with these other European groups that were not only EARN, they were moving on to the IP direction.
That were amazing stories from Dennis and Daniele. So they reflected on what the early days of EARN looked like and how useful it was for researchers to actually get connected. And Dennis mentioned that you, Daniel, were building the gateway system for sending email from EARN and other network across the world. Is this how you got involved in EARN?
Well, the thing was that actually electronic mail, news groups was something that only EUnet had. EARN didn't have that. EARN had mailing lists, which served a similar purpose. But the one universal application across all networks that were there, and you have to understand that before the internet, there were separate networks for specific target groups, like EARN for the university IBM mainframes, EUnet, or in Europe, EUnet for the UUCP computers, HEPNET for high energy physics, you name it. And then there were the national research networks that were just starting up. And the only application that worked through all those networks was email. And the way that worked is through what we would call now application layer gateways. So basically, you had a machine that was connected to both networks, and it received an email from one of the networks, and then resend it on the next network. And those were called the gateways. One of the biggest mail gateways in Europe was run at CERN at one point by a person called Denise Haggerty. She was the mail queen of CERN, and it was a very complicated setup connected to 4 or 5 different networks. CERN has a terrific library, and actually one of the presentations, how it all worked, is still preserved. But using the mail gateway at CERN from Germany was expensive because you had to send your email to Switzerland and then receive it again from Switzerland. So every time you cross an international boundary, it became like 10 to 50 times more expensive. So there was a pressure to have email gateways locally. And I was sort of uniquely placed because before I started on on EUnet at the computer science department, I had worked at the computing center where the IBM mainframe was. So I knew all the people there, and they respected me. And so I could go to them and say, hey, you are connected to this EARN network. I would like to connect my Unix computer to this EARN network too, and then we can exchange mail between the networks, and I can set up a gateway so that at least within Germany, we can exchange email between EARN and EUnet. And I convinced the computer science department to pay a little money for a special network interface, and I convinced the computing center people to basically give me a line. I convinced the electricians to actually run the line between the ground floor where the IBM mainframe was, and the basement where the lowly mini computers of the computer science department work. So it was all more a technical challenge, yes, but also a social challenge, yeah, to get the right people. I had actually to convince the guy in the computer center to make a software change that was not in the manual. And this is Germany, and people wouldn't do things that were not in the manual. And I said, yes, but I know this works. How do you know that? Well, I know it from this woman at CERN. And he went, and then I said, okay, I will do this work myself. This work had always had to be done in at the night or in the weekends, because the computer had to be stopped. And he didn't want to work in the weekend. And I said, okay, I'll do all your work in the weekend and do my little bit as well. Is that fine? And he said, yes, okay. And the rest is history.
Wow.
So we had a between EUnet, a mail gateway between EUnet and EARN in Dortmund, which was used quite a lot.
Which years this was?
This was probably in 1984,
Okay.
85. I don't remember. The software that we used on the Unix side was called UREP, Unix Remote Job Entry Program, somewhere from Canada. And it's easy to look up when that was first published. I think it was in 83. It must have been sort of mid 80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you remember the first transatlantic interconnection that you operated?
I was involved in. That was when I went to Amsterdam to the central European node of EUnet, which was run at the Centrum for Wiskunde and Informatica, which still exists out in the Watergraafsmeer. And I went there to just help, because there was a guy called Piet Beertema, who is very well known in the Dutch internet as Mr. .nl, because he administered .nl, and he was running the EUnet central node, and he was totally overworked, and people from Amsterdam cried, help, we need someone to help Piet. So I went there and helped Piet, and one of the jobs we had was to set up a first transatlantic link for EUnet, which was one of those links that also EARN used, like 19.2 kilobits per second, voice grade lease line with modems and things like that. And that was quite interesting, because at the other end was an institute called SEISMO, the Institute for Seismic Studies in Arlington, Virginia. They were interested in artificial earthquakes at the time, like the ones you get when you explode an atomic device. And they had lots of money for international links and for this kind of research. In order to get the two Unix computers to use this lease line, a special driver had to be written, and a guy called Rick Adams actually wrote that. It was called SLATATCH, serial line attach, and we had to compile it and get it to run, and then we could use that lease line. Later on, we actually put TCP/IP on that lease line, because then we could help each other out operationally. We could log into each other's machine, and because of the time difference, we could solve problems while they were sleeping, and they could solve problems while we were sleeping. And so that was our reason to use TCP/IP there.
As we mentioned earlier, Daniel Jennings actually played a crucial role in the deployment of TCP/IP protocols on NSFNET. He shared how his tenure at the US National Science Foundation started.
The man who was to be my direct boss ran the Office of Advanced Scientific Computing. This sort of program of actually investing in computing and networking was unusual for the National Science Foundation. So they set up a special office, and it's reported directly to the director of the National Science Foundation. And he rang me up one day and he said, Dennis, is there any possibility that you could be English? Now, this is not a polite question to ask an Irishman. There's 700 years of history between England and Ireland. And I said, well, actually, I was born in England, so I think I can get an English passport, which I did. So the fact that I was born in England allowed me to take the job in the United States, because the US federal government is not allowed to hire citizens of non-allied nations. And Ireland is neutral. But the UK, of course, is an ally of the United States. I actually started on the 2nd of January, 1985, to do a job that was not really specified, but it was to build a supercomputer access network. So I thought about it, and I decided that this network was going to be a network of networks running the TCP/IP protocols, so that every computer connected to one network would be able to talk across the networks to any other computer on the network, on another network, or more importantly, to a supercomputer. So you'd have these networks interconnected, all running the same protocol, all using the same address space, but able to communicate. That was the model of the internet that Bin Cerf and Bob Kahn had developed, but it was not the model that was favored by people in the United States at that time. The reason was that there were a number of commercial, very good networking protocols available. TCP/IP was largely the networking research people, but those other protocols were not internetworking protocols. So you could build a network using, say, DECnet, but you couldn't easily glue a series of networks together. So they weren't useful for doing what I wanted to do for NSFNET. And the only protocol that did that was the internet protocols, the TCP/IP, or as they were known at that stage, the DARPA protocols.
So they were not popular protocols, but you still made this decision which became critical. What was the actual thinking and reasoning behind it?
Because I wanted to deliver the idea that any computer on any network connected to this network of networks could access the supercomputers, even if they were on a different network. Also, the TCP/IP protocols, the DARPA protocols, were available on Unix systems, and Unix systems were becoming the computing resource that researchers used.
Since we're talking about TCP/IP, actually this year also marks 35 years of RIPE. That stood at the forefront of the growth and the growing demand for IP connections in Europe. Dennis mentioned that it was very difficult to convince stakeholders in the US to move to the TCP/IP protocol. Daniel, what was happening here in Europe at the time in the realm of IP?
Well, for us, it was difficult, and I think Dennis mentioned that too, that the official sort of governments and the government-sponsored research networks were not in favor of using TCP/IP. They were in favor of using the OSI suite of protocols, and one of the standing features of the OSI suite of protocols was that it was always just around the corner to be implemented, but never materialized. At EUnet, we were free because we didn't have government funding. We had to fund ourselves. So we used TCP/IP wherever we could. When we replaced the dial-up connections that we had, either by telephone or by the X25 networks, by leased lines because of cost economies, we put in TCP/IP on those because that was just easy for management, and we could get additional services, not just news groups and email. I always said EUnet was the first pan-European TCP/IP backbone. Because we were self-financed, we could do what we wanted, technically, whatever was good. It was much more difficult with national research networks or any network that sort of got external funding, because usually there are strings attached to that. But many of those networks and actually the customers of those networks demanded services. They were had contacts to the US. They knew NSFNET was coming along. The regional networks were coming along. Or every university could connect to it, not just the ones funded that had DARPA research going on. So they wanted the same thing, and they were clamoring at the doors. And what happened is that many university researchers actually connected to EUnet because that was there. And it cost relatively little for them, and they could fund it out of their own budget. And they didn't have to go to their national research network to beg for TCP/IP. They just got it. The first people who, or first of the national research networks that saw this were the ones in Scandinavia and the one in the Netherlands, called SurfNet, run by a guy called Kees Neggers at the time. The other guy was called Boudewijn Nederkorn, who played a big role in getting fiber rolled out in the Netherlands. But that's a different story. And they were sort of saying, okay, and I think Dennis mentioned that too, we're going to use TCP/IP in the interim. So Dutch pragmatism, yeah. Yes, smoking pot is illegal, but we will
We'll
the other
let
way.
you.
And they did the same. They basically said, yes, our official policy is OSI, but while this is not ready, we will have TCP/IP as well. At EUnet, we hate it because it cost us a lot of customers, because they then said, okay, it's provided by SurfNet now, we don't need you anymore. We knew that there was some coordination needed between all this, not at least coordinated addresses, IPv4 addresses at the time. Because, for instance, CERN, in their wisdom, when they set up their IP network, they used the number 1, network 1/8, because 1 is the first and CERN is the first. So yeah. And of course, that didn't work because somebody in the US already had that. And when these networks interconnected, and interconnecting them was also easy because it didn't need any special permission. You just talk to your neighbor and put a line, and it grew like that. We had to have coordinated address space and operational things. Rob Bloxheil and I, the first chair of RIPE, we got together with a few other people, for Enzo Valente from Italy, Bernhard Stockmann from Sweden, François Flicuger from CERN, and Rüdiger Volk from Germany, and probably a few others. And we met at CERN in a building that has since been demolished, so we can't put a plaque on the wall. And we said, okay, let's start this a coordination activity. And because we didn't want to be formal, found an association or something like that, because that would be a target. We said, okay, let's do this informally. Let's have a meeting, and let's maybe have other meetings, but not make too much noise about it, because we just want to do pragmatic stuff. And that's how RIPE came about. And that was that first meeting was in 1989, and then in 1989 later, the first RIPE meeting happened in Amsterdam at the CWI, because Rob Bloxheil was working at NICEF, which is the Dutch High Energy Physics Institute, which is in the same building basically, and we shared the same lecture theaters, and we could just rent lecture theaters and get coffee for very little money. So we had the first meeting there. And one of the first meetings, and now comes another crucial moment that sort of opened my eyes. In one of the first meetings, we decided we need a database for the addresses and for operational context. So that's what became the RIPE database. And very soon we realized that you can do lots of coordination work and so with volunteers, but running a database is something that you actually need some paid people for. And we wrote a paper that said, okay, we need a RIPE NCC. And we called it Coordination Center, so not Control Center or Information Center, as low a target as possible. And we got people together from the academics and also from EUnet and EARN to actually fund this activity. But the problem was to find a host, because we needed an organization that could actually employ people. It took us more than a year to actually find the host. And the eye-opening moment was when Rob Bloxheil, a very pragmatic and wise man, said, well, I think the time is right that we actually ask RARE to do this. I said, RARE? RARE was the association of all the government-sponsored national academic networks. And their official policy was OSI, 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 no TCP/IP, no TCP/IP. So I said, Rob, you're crazy.
Okay.
Because they cannot do this. It will be against their policy. And Rob said, well, I have the impression that some of them, like SurfNet and the Scandinavian networks, are sympathetic. And maybe we can convince the other ones that are not sympathetic that they should do this, because they can control it. And they can, when finally the glorious victory of OSI will come about, they can kill us, which we both knew would never happen, but they didn't. So we started a campaign with friends from all countries to convince their national research networks that, yeah, this was a good thing to do. And lo and behold, a couple of months later, the rare Council of Administration, sort of their highest body, offered to host the RIPE-NCC, and the rest is history. And that was another crucial moment, because at that point I realized TCP/IP was not stoppable anymore.
And now let's go back to the US. Dennis shared how he convinced supercomputers to get connected to ARPANET, the first public packet switched computer network through NSFNET, and how he built the backbone network connecting all the supercomputers together.
This was very attractive to the research community around the United States for several reasons. First of all, there was no national network in the United States. There was ARPANET, and the universities on ARPANET were the elite. They had contracts with DARPA, and there were very few of them. There was the Computer Science Network, but that was only for computer scientists. There was SPAN, the Space and Aeronautics Network, which was for NASA and also their researchers. There was HEPNET, the High Energy Physics Network, for high energy physics and nuclear bombs, the energy department. But there was no national network available for everybody. And I thought that that's what we should be building. So first of all, there was the model, the network of networks, our internet, and associated with that, the TCP/IP protocols. And secondly, I decided that this was going to be a general purpose network for all research. And nobody questioned that, which was terrific, because it turned out to be the right thing to do. It could easily have been decided that what we want to do with the supercomputer access network is give the money to the supercomputers, and they build a network for the supercomputer users. But I argued, if the idea of the supercomputer access program is to bring supercomputing, to make supercomputing available to a much wider group of researchers, then naturally one would build a network for everybody rather than just for the existing supercomputer users. And that was critical. And then I designed the implementation model for the network. It would have campus networks, which we wouldn't fund. That was the responsibility of the campuses.
Okay.
The university had funded. And at that stage, in '85, campus networks were all the hot thing on campuses. Didn't go down terribly well with some of the supercomputer users, because they didn't really want to have to deal with the campus. They wanted to have their private lines to supercomputers. Secondly, that we would fund supercomputer networks, and we would assist regional networks to develop. And I did that because what I wanted to do was to get other money involved. I mean, I had $9 million to spend in fiscal '85 and $11 million to spend in fiscal '86. When I left at the beginning of '86, but I'd committed all the money. But that wasn't enough. I mean, it was a huge budget, but it wasn't enough to do the sort of things that I thought were necessary. And I had a meeting in Cornell, and they told me about their state network they were planning, called NSFNET, the New York State Research and Education and Research Network. And the state of New York, and this was quite common across the United States, was interested in investing in technology. It wanted to develop an industrial program, and it wanted to invite technology companies to the state. So they were willing to spend some money. The universities all wanted to connect to the ARPANET, and suddenly they were offered through the NSFNET a way of doing this. All one needed was a leader to pull all this together. And I would say, and I will support partial funding of your state or regional network. So in late, probably September '85, or early September 1985, we published a solicitation. And the reason for it was that this meant that ordinary universities, there's no such thing as an ordinary university, but universities who weren't the special ones connected to the ARPANET could also connect to the internet. And as I paraphrased, the idea was, you mean we can be like the big guys? Yeah. Where do I sign?
Yeah.
So it was tremendously successful. And then the last component was the backbone network. And my idea was that we would build a backbone network connecting all the supercomputer centers together. So on the 16th of September 1985, I went to a review meeting with the supercomputer centers. And I outlined what was happening. And I said, and the next thing is I want to build the backbone network, connecting all the supercomputer centers together and run by the supercomputer centers.
Across different states in the US?
Across the United States,
the whole country?
Let me segue sideways for a moment. I talked earlier about the costs of lines in Europe.
Yeah.
But in the United States, fiber optic cable was being already in 84, 85. The AT&T monopoly had been broken, and bandwidth was dropping in price every day.
Oh, so they were so much ahead.
They were so much ahead. When I started at the National Science Foundation, it cost about $1 million for a 56 kb line from New York to Los Angeles. By the time I left 15 months later, it was about $1 million for a T1 line. The competition had driven down the prices enormously. So I told I was back at the meeting with the supercomputer centers, I want to build a backbone network to connect all the networks together, connect all the supercomputer centers together, and I want you guys to run it. And the answer was, we're not going to do that. No, we're not in the networking business, we're in the supercomputer business. So I was a bit crestfallen, I have to say. But that night, over dinner, I would go to each of the tables and talk to people. And basically, I would say to the supercomputer center directors, you realize that if we have this backbone network, maybe at low speed initially, but it'll grow in speed, then your center could service researchers all across the United States. And of course, your center is going to be the best center, and therefore you'll attract. And
you convinced every of them on the same.
Everybody that this was the way to go. We reconvened the meeting at 9 o'clock the following morning. And one of the directors banged the table and said, it's about time we had this backbone network. So we adjourned the meeting, sat down at a picnic table outside the cafeteria in Boulder, Colorado, at a center called NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And everybody sketched what they thought the network would be. And then I took all these sketches and I sketched a sort of compromise. So from rejection to acceptance. So I had my model, my implementation model, my standard protocols, and the network underway.
And how many supercomputers we're talking about
There were 5 supercomputers. There was Pittsburgh, Cornell, Illinois, Princeton, NCAR, which was an existing one, and San Diego supercomputers, 6 supercomputers.
And they all agreed.
And they all agreed. Some more reluctantly than others.
Moving further in time, a major development for the Internet in Europe was European Internet Backbone, EBONE, that was created in 1991 by a number of research network managers. It was open to publicly financed academic networks and private commercial networks. Daniele Bovio was a member of the EBONE action team, and he talks about how this became an important step amidst the growth of networking in Europe.
We saw that cooperating with these other European groups that were not only EARN, they were moving on to the IP direction, we could benefit of some more bandwidth. Also, what happened at the same time is that a couple of years earlier, actually, BITNET had a similar problem. The internet was growing much stronger in the US because there was no conflicts of any kind. And Princeton University developed a specific application called EUnet that would allow to carry the traffic, the NJE kind of remote spooling communication system traffic that we used in EARN and BITNET over to internet circuits, over IP circuits. And so the two things in Europe were happening pretty much at the same time. So we said, well, we can try that, right? There was a famous meeting at in October 1991 at the Amsterdam Zoo. All the international networks, all the national networks of Europe pretty much were there, plus EARN as an international organization. And the memorandum of understanding of how operate and how to finance this backbone was drafted. And two groups were created, two technical groups, the EBONE Operation Group and the EBONE Action Group. The EBONE Action Group was, they were both comprised of engineers. The EBONE Operation Group was the group of engineers supposed to really manually, physically install the routers and configure the routing tables and everything. And the EBONE Action Team was supposed to actually come up with a proposition for a backbone. And since the idea of the EBONE concept started in the north, the first backbone that they were proposing was a backbone with 4 nodes and was sort of a diamond based on the north of Europe. EARN at that time had this major hub in the south of France, in the city of Montpellier. And the EARN international transatlantic connection to the US was going from Montpellier to the United States. So all the major lines for EARN from Italy, Spain, Israel, wherever, Germany, were going to Montpellier. And there was a mismatch between the proposed EBONE architecture and the EARN major point of traffic. I was asked to participate in this EBONE action team representing EARN, but nothing much was happening. So I took the initiative to organize the first meeting of the EBONE action team in Paris. When you put engineers in a room, they have to talk about the backbone. Everybody wants to be on the backbone. Everybody wants to have the biggest line, etc., etc. So I let them talk and talk and talk. And then it was lunchtime. I said, okay, EARN is paying for the lunch. I had a reservation at a brasserie across the street from the university. We went there, and they sat and said, you can order whatever you want. And the guy said, can we order wine? I said, of course. In France, everybody drinks wine for lunch, right? We had some wine and some, Then we went back to the meeting, and it was a totally different atmosphere. And then I came up with my proposal and said, look, and the idea was to have a ring, so the backbone would be redundant. If one of the link would die, traffic would still go around in the other direction. I said, let's make a node as a pentagon, not as a square. So let's add Montpellier in these 4 nodes backbone that you have designed there. Just gonna cost us 1 more circuit, because 4 nodes, 4 circuits, 5 nodes, 5 circuits, right? And then present this option to the board of directors of EBONE, that are the people that the administrators that have to decide how to spend the money. So let's present these 2 propositions: the 4 nodes that you originally presented, and the 5 nodes that I would like to see. And then let's decide. Now, the interesting thing is that at the meeting, there was also an IBM representative, because IBM was already planning its next step of supercomputer, high-speed network, etc., etc. And the IBM guy looked at me and said, oh, I like this one much better. If you do this one, if you do 5 nodes, IBM will put money into it. As it happened, the 5 nodes backbone was approved. And when I talked to one of the members of the board, he told me, it was an easy decision. I don't know why you engineer couldn't come up with that yourself from the beginning, And so that was the birth of the first pan-European IP backbone. It was called EBONE 92. It was supposed to be experimental, short-lived, but of course, eventually it lasted much longer. The advantage what was it that then EARN was able to migrate most of its traffic using this VMNet protocol over IP links, could get rid of the little saturated line we had. And then by the end, by 1995, when EARN was merged with RARE to form Terena, all the applications, email, file transfer, messages were basically migrated over an IP infrastructure.
I've read that a EBONE consortium was established at the RIPE meeting in Geneva in 1991. Daniel, so what was RIPE's involvement in this?
Well, RIPE's involvement in the early 90s was to bring people together, nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't I think EBONE might not even have been on the agenda of the RIPE meeting. It was just that all the people who were in in the room at CERN in Geneva who were ready to make that step. And actually, the formal establishment of the EBONE was in Amsterdam in Artis, in the zoo.
Yes, I actually wanted to ask you because both Dennis and Daniele mentioned there was this famous zoo meeting. Why it was in the zoo?
Well, we needed the room, and Artis, the Amsterdam Zoo, was renting out conference rooms, and it was a convenient room. The building is still there. If you're in Amsterdam, you go to the zoo along the Plantage Middelaan. There's a building which has two lions in front of it. Another part of it is a conference room, and in that conference room actually is where EBONE formally saw the light of day. I was there.
Wow, that's very interesting. So basically, then RIPE was the place where people met, and it was not that you only discussed the IP.
There was already sort of in EBONE, and I think Daniele mentioned the sites, the original sites, and he was forgetting one, which was Amsterdam. It came about from informal agreements of sharing lines that we had before. There were relatively big lines between Amsterdam and Stockholm, which were shared by EARN, HEBNet, the High Energy Physics Net, and EUnet. So we all paid a share of those lines, because the pricing model of the PTTs at the time was when you paid double the money, you got 4 times the bandwidth. So it made sense to actually pool money and buy a bigger line for everyone. We did both between Amsterdam and Stockholm, and also between Amsterdam and Geneva for CERN. There was this informal sharing already going on, and EBONE was sort of the natural continuation of that.
The internet in Europe reached businesses and homes subsequently, sometime later than in the US. Daniele Bovio was involved in launching the European America Online networks. In 1994, they reached 1 million subscribers and linked subscribers to the internet for the first time. Daniele reflects on his work there.
At that time, I moved to America Online, and the main problem of America Online was that back then, especially early 95, 96, there was no real internet for public in Europe yet, right?
It was only for the research.
Was only mainly for research, and some companies, some some industries were connected. Most of the data, the internet was in the United States. So all the content, the books, the movies, everything was in the United States. So AOL had to buy a lot of transatlantic capacity to allow its customers in Europe to access this wealth of data and information. And given the costs that were horrific then, a huge portion of the budget, the business plan for America Online, was to pay for transatlantic capacity, okay? And so what happened is that basically I was in charge for America Online of supporting the operation of the European businesses, provide build an access network that meant racks of modems that people could call from home for their modem, and then circuits from this bank of modems to the data center in the United States. America Online was a client server application that started before the internet, so everything was inside, if you wish. You give access to somebody, you send into your data center where he finds a channel for sport, a channel for health, a channel for food, and so forth. And so when these new cables came about, the various PTTs, the various in the United States, the large telephone like Bell, AT&T and companies, and European PTTs, Deutsche Telekom, France Telecom, Italia Telecom, put together resources to build these transatlantic cables. And they were the only owner of these transatlantic cables. So nobody could use them but the PTTs, because in the US it was open market, but in Europe was still monopoly. So only if you were a PTT you could go and buy capacity on these cables. Then pushed by the regulation concept, the European Commission had to change the rules and accept that PTTs were no longer the monopoly in each country. Anybody could become a telecom operator. Doesn't need to be a government company. And a number of companies were created, both in Europe and internationally, to build infrastructure. And some of these companies developed the technology to lay transatlantic cables. Until then, the cables were called TAT, transatlantic transfer, and there were 13 of these cables, one more powerful than the other. They were, of course, went from copper, then eventually to fiber. They were using fiber. And there was the last of these financed by the PTTs was called TAT-14, was the 14th of these transatlantic cables. But around that time, there were companies that started laying their own private cables. In particular, there was a joint venture between two American telephone companies called Cable and Wireless and WorldCom. They joined forces and they built the first private transatlantic cable called Gemini. Gemini was going from England to Nova Scotia in the United States. And if you had filed for becoming a telecom operator in any small, big, large, in any country, you could go and tell them, sell me capacity on your cable, sell me a fiber pair. And that was the concept that was determined at the time by this company was the concept of an indefeasible right of usage. You could buy, paying a lump sum of money, the right to use the cable for a given capacity for a period of 10 years. That is the definition of IRU. And the feasible right to use for 10 years, this part of cable is mine, and I financed it by paying upfront money. You needed to be a telecom operator to do that, right? And the fact is that the need for traffic was increasing, so then another company came up called Atlantic Crossing, and they also laid another cable. And then another came up, and so forth and so forth. By year 2000, there were several cables. So the monthly price for these cables, for a circuit from London to New York, was about more than $60,000 per month.
Okay, and how many customers back then you had?
Oh, our average customers was consuming between 3,000 and 4,000 bits per second at peak. And then I said, well, we need to find a way to reduce this cost. So I said, well, let's convince AOL to file and become a telecom operator. So thanks to the legal office of AOL, I got a consulting firm in the United States that said, yes, you can become an international carrier. Unfortunately, the upper management of American Online decided not to do that. They said, we do not want to become a telecom operator. We are a content provider. So I started scratching my head. And then I came up with an idea, which maybe I came up with the idea because I'm Italian, I don't know. Somebody told me it was blackmail. I said, I don't think so. But anyway, I went to some of these carriers, to these telecom, the new ones in Europe.
Okay, so they were
in America also, that they had the right to buy, you know, because they already had the telecommunication license.
Yeah.
Only they wanted to rent it to me at the monthly cost. I went to them and I told them, look, I can become, as an American Online, as a telecom operator. They didn't know that management said no. I'm going to file a license, and then I'm going to be able to buy the capacity, and then I'm going to become a competitor of yours. Because as soon as I have the capacity and I have a license, I can sell to everybody else. There will be one more competitor for you. You don't want that.
And
right?
these were private companies back already?
Yes, well,
so
they were like mostly Americans were more interested in doing that. And so I told them, look, why don't we do a deal like that? I pay you upfront the cost of the IRU, okay? Right now. I don't want to pay monthly. I give you all the money immediately in your pocket, right? I finance the buy of the IRU, the indefeasible right of use, and then you rent it, you buy it yourself with the money I give you, and then you turn around, you add whatever fraction of cost you want to charge me, and then you lease it to me for 10 years, not per month, on a 10-year basis, because I give you the money. So for you, there is no investment. I'm making the effort of making the investment, and then you turn around and you give it to me. And some companies said, but little by little, insisting, I managed to convince a company to do that. The first deal I was proposed, I needed one STM1 155 megabit from UK from London to Virginia with the data center. And then I came to with this proposition to the businesses, and I said, look, I negotiated this. If you want to buy, you have to put up $27 million, but your cost, your monthly cost, amortized over 10 years for this, will go down. In the case of London, will get down 88%. In the case of Germany, will go down 84%. In the case of France, will go down 91%.
It's huge.
Okay? And these people were like, they wanted to kiss me, okay?
Yeah.
So, because
course, you're
their main
saving the
cost
money.
was not anymore the infrastructure. They could invest all this money in marketing. And this concept that I kind of invented was then dubbed capitalized lease. Another idea of mine is that what do you do when the first cable is full? Because that we're given now all this money for this capacity of invest in marketing, allow them to have way more customers. So the traffic increased enormously. Plus America Online had really connected with the internet at that point, so there was also a lot of traffic going out of the data centers in Virginia. I went and I said, look, I already gave you $27 million, right? Now you gave me 3 STM1s, and now I need an STM4. How much of the money I paid for the first investment are you willing to discount me because I'm upgrading, basically, right? Turn it the way you want. You can take back from me the STM1 that I paid. You sell me an STM4, but the money I gave you for that one that I give back to you, right, is an asset. So how much you put on that value on the STM4? And a couple of people said, well, maybe 50%. And I found a company level 3 that said, we'll give you back 100%. All the money you gave us already will be discounted against the new purchase of a larger circuit. And that concept was afterwards dubbed recapitalization. So you capitalize the first lease, now you recapitalize the lease on a different circuit. And that drove the price down even further. To upgrade from STM1 to STM4, some country had to pay few $1,000. In the case of London, they got some money back.
Interesting.
Because at the same time, the prices had reduced a little bit.
That's interesting. I don't think now these things happen, right?
I don't know, but most of these cables are still in operation. A lot of cables were planned, they were installed. After I left AOL, I didn't follow anymore what happened, but I know that, dense division multiplexing is still much the hype. Now there are, of course, has been used terrestrially everywhere, and so, of course, now there is other means to cross the Atlantic. There is the low-orbit satellites. Stuff doesn't necessarily need to go through the cables anymore.
I spoke with Jeff Houston about it recently.
Yeah. That could be the topic probably for another interesting podcast.
All these decisions that my guests today are remembering led to what the internet has become today. I asked Dennis, could you have imagined that this would become what it is now? The internet that is available almost to everyone globally?
Sort of yes and no is the answer to that question. Yes, we did imagine that this would work. It would provide a very useful infrastructure for research. I wrote a paper with a number of colleagues, which was published in Science, which was the premier research journal in the United States. They had an edition at the beginning of 1986, which was a review edition, and they asked me to write an article on computer networking for scientists, which I wrote them, kind of proud of it. And in that, Larry did a lot of the writing with me. And we wrote at the beginning of the paper and at the end of the paper our vision for the network that we envisaged. And our vision is of a network of networks which will enable the researcher through the window of their workstation to access all the computing, communications, data, software resources that they need to do their work. Now, unspoken was the idea that this was actually, useful for more than the academic research community. And we thought that, maybe industry would get interested because we'd already indications that the industry that was working with universities on research wanted the same facilities as the researchers wanted. But did we envisage it would become, at that time, 1985, 1986, the global communications infrastructure? No, we did not. Did we envisage that it would replace every other communications infrastructure, essentially? No, we did not. Did we envisage that all the services that we thought of would become the province of global, massive companies? No, we did not. We could have, because, I mean, obviously, if you're providing that sort of information and access resource for researchers, then the same model through the window of your workstation or your phone, as we have nowadays, can access everything. But it didn't really occur to us at that time. Later on, in the early 90s, I was asked to talk to industry in Ireland. And at that stage, I'd become convinced that actually this internet thing was going to be huge. And actually, it was going to replace all the communications infrastructure, that everything would run on IP networks.
And what made you think that? Was there some specific maybe moment or?
Well, it had happened so rapidly in the US, and so many the ISPs had been developed, the internet service providers, and actually quite a lot of the ISPs were founded by the regional networks, because the financial model that I'd put in place was partial funding. The idea was that they would become self-sufficient. To become self-sufficient, they not only had university clients, but they had commercial clients. Commercial clients, of course, hired students to do research. I mean, a student coming from a university, having had all these communication facilities, basically would come and say, well, where's my laptop? Where's my workstation? Where's my internet? So I can do work. So very rapidly in the US, in the late 80s, it became part of the commercial infrastructure. And then the ISPs, I mentioned the man called Bill Schrader from Cornell. He started one of the very first ISPs. So I was aware that this was happening. It wasn't happening yet in Europe, but that it would happen, and that basically that model would become the support for business activities as well. First of all, research, and then business.
So what I hear from all of the guests, those early days of the internet and the communities that started it, like RIPE, were all about collaboration and goodwill, and everyone had a very common goal, open to explore new things, which were probably unpredictable because, well, now what's the internet? It's everywhere. So I want to quote the vice chair of RIPE, Neil O'Reilly, who said during the EARN panel at C12, this community, the EARN community, had an ethos of collaboration and pragmatism that we still have in RIPE today. Daniel, do you agree with the statement that RIPE still has this ethos?
I think we still have that. What we don't have anymore is this pioneering spirit. You know, when you're doing a new thing and you're convinced that it is great, and you know everybody will want it, and you're building it from scratch, and it wasn't there before. You're pioneering it. It is a feeling that I cannot describe. It's just so much fun. I think we still have a tradition of being collaborative, of seeking rough consensus rather than stressing our differences, and be nice to each other. There is less of that than there was before, and that's partly also because the climate has changed. I mean, we are now in an era where confrontation and differences are much more pronounced and much more stressed than commonalities. We are in an era where whole countries are fiercely divided, some 50-50, and people seek more their differences than their commonalities. And in such an environment, of course, we exist, and it has influence on us. But I still think that as a group, as a community, we have the cooperative spirit, the spirit of respect for one another, and the common purpose. I very, very deeply believe that. Maybe that's just because I'm an old guy and I am a romantic, but I personally still believe that.
To conclude this special episode, Denis and Daniele are remembering the top 3 most important moments that shaped the internet as we know today. They have overseen themselves.
For me, the first moment was I was in the National Science Foundation, and the National Science Board, which was a sort of supervisory board of the National Science Foundation, I'm not quite sure of the relationship, was having a review meeting. It was having their annual review of the National Science Foundation, its programs and so on. And everybody was very busy in that. I was 3 or 4 or 5 weeks there thinking about this problem, how I was going to approach it, what were the principles of the architecture I wanted to develop, and I was in no hurry. When suddenly my colleagues on the supercomputer side said, Denis, you have to make a presentation to the National Science Board. I said, what? So I sat down, and with an overhead foil, maybe you remember, with the overhead projectors used to have plastic foils, which you could write on with marker pens. So I sketched a sort of network of networks. And to the astonishment, and this was my conceptual model of the NSFNET, a network of networks, or an internet, networks connected at the campus and the user, cross-connected to everybody else, including to the network on the supercomputer, and that would allow anybody on one network to talk to a supercomputer or to anybody else. So this fuzzy model, I still have a photocopy of that slide. And I put that up, and to the astonishment of my colleagues, I talked for 20 minutes to the National Science Board, the highest board of the National Science Foundation, about my vision for this open network. And the only question I got was from somebody who said, well, Denis, I think I understand what you're talking about, but I don't think your sketch is technically correct. And I said, this is a conceptual model. It probably is completely wrong, but it's just to give the idea of what we're trying to achieve. So that was that was big moment. Second, I think the big moment was when the Supercomputer Center directors in the reconvened meeting on the 17th of September demanded the network that previously they had completely refused. And the third, I think, was after I'd served my time, about 15 months at the National Science Foundation, I was on leave of absence from University College Dublin. I had 15 months leave of absence, and I had actually extended it from 12 months to 15 months to align with the Irish tax year so that I wouldn't run into complicated income tax issues. And just before I left, Ira Fuchs, the same guy that I talked about before, rang me up and said, Denis, is there any chance that you could extend your stay in the United States and come up to Princeton and help us with the Supercomputer Center? We've run into difficulties. And I said, well, I'd love to do that, but I'm not going to ask my university to extend my leave of absence, my break. And he said, well, who do we talk to in the University College Dublin? I suppose you have to talk to the president. I suppose your president of Princeton has to talk to the president of University College Dublin and ask, would the university be prepared to extend my leave of absence for 4 months? And so Ira said, Grant, leave it to me. Next thing I get a call from a man called Bill Bowen, who was the president of Princeton. He went on to be the president of the Carnegie Foundation. And he introduced him and said, Denis, who's the president of University College Dublin? And I said, it's Paddy Masterson. He said, is that a man or a woman? I said, it's a man. He said, well, can you arrange for me to call him? So I called Ireland. There's a 5-hour time difference. I called Ireland, asked to speak to the president's office, explained that the president of Princeton wanted to talk to Paddy Masterson, president of UCD, and ask for an extension of my leave of absence. And when would the president be available? And they rang me back and said, the president is available at 9:15 Irish time, which is 4:45 a.m. US time. So I went back to Bill Bowen and said, 4:45 in the morning. Fine. So he got up, he phoned the president of the two presidents, they had a chat, and the result was that they agreed that I'd go back to UCD, to University College Dublin, and be paid for them, and then go on a secondment to Princeton. So technically I was back in UCD. Princeton would pay my expenses. UCD would pay my salary. Princeton would reimburse UCD, and I would help the center.
That's a good business deal you got.
So I brought my family back to Ireland and then went back. I worked 20-hour days for a long time. They'd run into all sorts of management difficulties. But one of the things that I learned very quickly was the consultants that they had hired in Princeton to build the center and build the network had decided they were going to run DECnet on the John von Neumann Center. That was the name of the center. The organization was the Consortium for Scientific Computing. They were going to run DECnet on the network. And this was a 1.5 megabit network. This was a fast network. And I said, you can't do that. And they said, what do you mean we can't do that? Well, I said, the guy who's just left from the National Science Foundation said you have to run TCP/IP. Oh, that was you, wasn't it? Yes, but now I have a different role. We have to run TCP/IP. And they did. And even when the initial backbone, which was only at 56 kilobits, which is very slow and was swamped very quickly, the John von Neumann Center network along the East Coast became the most important network in the emerging internet. So those are the three moments that come to mind: the conceptual design, the success with the backbone, and actually stopping a disaster just by happenstance, and being in Princeton and saying, no, you have to run TCP/IP.
That's great.
The first major step was to convince the European governments to stop trying to use a protocol invented in an obscure room at the desk without testing it first. That was OSI. That was the first major step that allowed the internet in Europe to take off. The other major step was clearly the fall of the monopolies in Europe. That really allowed competition and allowed American companies to install these cables. That gave us the capability to buy at a different, price, at an affordable price, the capacity. The other thing that really changed, I think, is that, is what everybody knows. Nowadays, the internet has made us mobile. We can work from wherever without being forced to go to the office. We can safely communicate with each other. Even private communication may happen through the corrected, properly encrypted channels. So that clearly allowed people, on one end, to communicate much easier. Unfortunately, my personal opinion is that nowadays that also kind of separates people a little bit to some other degree. And that's because people back then were forced to go into the room together and talk and work and socialize. Now they are not forced to do that anymore. And that is probably one of the things that nobody back then had foresaw or thought. Back then a video conference was something you would see on the Star Trek movies. And that's, that I think is a little bit pushing people aside instead of, in spite of this social media kind of, social media, but people just, they're socializing with their screen. There are plenty of friends that they never met. And that, I think, is the part that in my life I witnessed it, and then it's a major difference to how we were dealing with each other in the 80s and the 90s, and compared to what people did with each other now.
Yeah. But it still unites people as well, because we're
there
able
is plenty
to
of positive. There is access to information. There is access to things that before were just unimaginable. There is access to music. There is access to things that before was not possible. So absolutely, the positive by far overweight the negative. What I'm a little bit concerned about is now, but this maybe is a topic for a different podcast with somebody else, is that these behaviors that we are showing is owned by private companies. And they are using algorithms to tell us what we want to see. What scares me is that basically these things, this process is going faster and faster. Now, before you had to click on advertisement and then maybe a day later you will get, you will click on a website that tells you about hiking shoes, and basically we are feeding ourselves with our own thing, and they own it though. They own our information, they send it back to us, and they feed us back. It's a circle, and it's getting faster and faster. And that can quickly degenerate, I think, depending on what people do. And I don't think these people should own this data, frankly. It should be our data and should be available to everybody.
Yeah, I think that this community...
If it is available to everybody, then I think that creates a playing, level field. If only somebody owns it, which is our information, and we give it to them for free, okay?
That's the scary part, but let's hope that the community kind of
come up with a solution.
We always say that. These are quite important moments to remember. Daniel, I was actually just thinking that for this episode, I talked to 3Ds, Daniel, and Dennis, but let's wrap up. I have the last question to you, Daniel. Could you have imagined back then, when you were building the internet in Europe, that this thing, the internet, would become what it has become today?
No, I think, and I heard anybody who says unequivocally says yes to this is a liar. I don't think any of us could imagine it. And Dennis, in his usual way, said yes and no.
Yes, he did.
and I will say yes and no too, because yes, I think in the early days of RIPE, in the beginning of the 90s, I was convinced that what we were building would change science and engineering. It would change science and engineering in a way that one could have much bigger corporations. People across geographic distances could cooperate much more easily than before. I was fascinated when I wrote my first paper with like two other guys who were one in France and one in Japan, and we could exchange drafts. And while I was sleeping, the guy in Japan would work, and I knew this was going to change things. But I was personally very much limiting myself to science and engineering. The time when I realized that this was bigger was actually my mother-in-law made me realize that, because she was visiting us in Amsterdam, and she was sort of lamenting that she didn't get the parish newsletter before she had to leave home in Germany. And I went on the web, and this must have been sort of mid-90s, when there was already a web. And there was apparently in that parish, there was a computer nerd who put the parish newsletter on the web. So I found it, I printed it off for her and said, here. And then she first understood sort of what this networking thing was that I did, because I think my parents-in-law really thought that I was a drug dealer, because I had abducted their daughter to Amsterdam, and I was traveling all over the world doing this networking thing. It must be something strange, right? But when I could give her the parish newsletter, she understood, and I sort of, that was a aha moment for me, where I said, hey, this is bigger than science and engineering. This is even the church in this little village, is on it. This must be it.
And this was the end of this episode. Please subscribe and rate the RIPE Labs podcast on whichever platform you're listening it to, and stay tuned for the next episodes. Bye-bye.